It's Tuesday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me, Conservative MP and Chair of the Defence Select Committee, Tobias Ellwood. SNP Deputy Westminster Leader, Kirsten Oswald. Times radio presenter, Ayesha Hazarika. And the editor of The Spectator, Fraser Nelson. Today.
Does the Prime Minister have the support of the party, Minister?
Boris Johnson faces the biggest rebellion of his premiership.
Governments love taking powers. They're not that keen on releasing them, as far as I've seen.
Labour will vote with the government.
We will always support measures designed to protect public health. That includes the measures in Plan B.
But this restaurateur tells us Omicron is already costing her tens of thousands in lost bookings. And are our human rights laws British enough?
We can strengthen our tradition of liberty, but add some common sense, and that's what our plan will achieve.
So, Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, said only a couple of weeks ago that this Christmas will be considerably better than last Christmas. In brief, Tobias, will it?
Well, we need to get behind the Prime Minister's grand plan, which is to make sure we get through this latest mutation. There's some aspects of that there are concerned. That'll come up today as the vote. But absolutely, it's good to see people listening to that message. You see the queues outside St Thomas's and other parts of the country, people wanting to get that third jab. That's how we're going to get through this latest mutation. But the details on the passports itself, you just heard there from somebody in the industry. I represent Bournemouth. We've got a big tourism operation there. They're scratching their heads how it can be that you can walk in with a negative lateral flow test or that sort of dog-eared certification that says you have 2 jabs that was completed 6 months ago.
You're voting
that
against,
doesn't make
you're
sense.
Voting against that bit this afternoon.
That particular section, but absolutely with the Prime Minister on the wider scheme of things to get us through Plan B.
Right. Ayesha, do you think it'll be a better Christmas this year than last?
I don't know is the answer. If you look at the statistics from the National Health and Security Agency, they're now looking at, they're saying 200,000 cases a day and that growing exponentially. We know from the experts that this is highly, highly transmissible. The question is we just don't really know at the moment. We all hope that we can have a better Christmas than last year. Last year I spent Christmas by myself. Many people had a terrible time over Christmas last year. But I think for many of us, there's strong feelings of déjà vu.
Kirsten, I'm going to show our viewers this in the Times. COVID in Scotland. We must limit mixing sturgeon to tell families. We are expecting further restrictions from the First Minister being announced later on today. Deputy First Minister John Swinney previously said people could expect a normal Christmas. It sounds like it's not going to be Christmas as we know it in Scotland.
I think that we all have to wait and see exactly where we are. And as you say, we are expecting to hear from the First Minister later on, but it's such a fast-moving situation. So I do hope that it is a better Christmas for a lot of people than it was last year. Ayesha was just saying there that she was just on her own last Christmas and that, you know, it has been really difficult for people. But whatever we do, I think we have to accept that this is a really challenging time and we need to follow the guidelines that are there to keep us safe. And certainly not a situation any of us would have chosen to be in, but nonetheless, here we are and we need to do our best to keep safe and I hope we can enjoy some of it too.
Right, we're also expecting more restrictions to be announced in Wales, if not today, then perhaps later in the week. Fraser, picking up on what Ayesha said about that 200,000 Omicron cases every day, we heard it from the Health Secretary yesterday. Do you think Boris Johnson's going to have to go further with restrictions?
Perhaps, yes. Certainly talking to people in government, a lot of them think that the restrictions right now are very lax. Why, for example, are we told we can't go to work, but we can go to parties? You don't have to be an epidemiologist to work out that's obviously irreconcilable, those two. Right now, of course, there's lots of restaurants taking in huge amounts of money. This is the busiest time of the year. Now, perhaps Boris Johnson feels he can't really tell us not to go to parties when his staff were having so many of them in Number 10 last year. He's politically sensitive in that issue. But right now, the more concern that I pick up from government ministers that I speak to, the more I think that they are going to do something more akin to lockdown in about a week's time.
OK, well, that is very interesting. What's your reaction to that? More restrictions? I mean, you're not happy with the one of them that they're introducing today. No,
we need to be led, I think, by the science. So we need to see the data that then supports that. That means that the nation, goes with the government. That's what we need to see. My concern is that we are then leaning once again on our brilliant NHS to get us through this. And I have a concern about whether or not we are ready. We're on the bus, off the bus here. We need to have a better system, a better crisis management capability to deal. There will be probably a requirement for a fourth jab, a fifth jab, and so forth. There may be another wave, another letter of the Greek alphabet that we'll associate with this. Are we prepared for this, rather than just this final push over Christmas? That's the greater capability that I'd like to see the government lean into.
Well, you talk about the greater capability. I mean, literally in the last few minutes, we've just seen the Shadow Health Secretary, Wes Streeting, tweeting in response to reports that there are no PCR tests available in England for people to confirm if they have COVID.
I'd like to see a new government department created. We should have done this a long time ago. We did this for Brexit, for climate change as well. Why not for this pandemic as well? So they can lean into these issues and make sure we've got the right kid in the right place. We can't have this attitude that it's just another 3 or 4 months and then we're back to normal. No, COVID has been here for a couple years. It's going to be with us for a couple more years as well, because a new mutation is very likely to take place. That is the attitude. Deal with this in years, not in months.
Right. I mean, in terms of that infrastructure, we're being told now that they are available. Clearly, there's some mixed messaging, although I think briefly they weren't. What does that say, Aisha, to you about the infrastructure, the ability of the country to sort of answer the demand from the Prime Minister to jab 1 million people a day, or at least offer them boosters?
Well, a lot of this comes down to planning, and I do agree with what Tobias was saying about resilience in the system. And the Times carries a story today from lots of bosses in the NHS saying that they weren't adequately consulted with by the Prime Minister ahead of his big address to the nation on Sunday night, saying, look, we've got to hit this target of 1 million jabs a day. We've got to get everybody jabbed by the end of December. That's already looking like it's slipping. What bosses are now saying is it's going to be very difficult to hit that target. Possibly people will have their booking by the end of December. But I think with so much of this, there's the going out and making the big statement and the big pledge and the big promise. There is then backing that up with the logistics and the infrastructures and the systems and dialogue. And one of the lessons we have to learn from this pandemic across everything, government, local government, national government, business, is building more resilience into all our systems.
All right, well, while that is going on, let me just show you the Daily Express front page, if we can, because MPs, like Tobias, will be voting on new COVID rules for England later. Boris Johnson braced for a sizable Conservative rebellion, potentially the biggest of his premiership so far. Here it is. Boris pleads with rebels, back my balanced measures. We're expecting 4 votes today, Fraser. Can you unpack what's happening in Parliament for us?
Well, right now, I mean, sure, technically they're voting against the vaccine passports, as Tobias has just told us he will. There are something like 81 people so far on the record saying they'll do that. We can probably expect perhaps some resignations today as people do that. Now, this is for 2 things. One, the government has failed completely to have any evidence, to provide any evidence at all that vaccine passports would work. So how could you ask Parliament to back something that the government itself can't say? For example, a vaccine passport gives you the green light if you've had 2 AstraZeneca jabs. We found out a few days ago that 2 AstraZeneca jabs do not stop you catching Omicron. So in that case, why would you be any more safe, as it were, than somebody who hasn't had the jab? But if the government itself cannot explain this, then what we see is Boris Johnson pressing his majority button, thinking, I don't have to explain myself. I don't care. I've got a big majority. You guys will do what I say. What we're seeing today is his party rising up saying, no, we will not do what you say. We are through having these half-baked ideas coming out of 10 Downing Street, whether it's with the Owen Paterson vote or other things. And they are saying, we're going to have you rely on Keir Starmer to get this through because the Tories will not back you.
Right. Well, Kirsten, there have been COVID passes in Scotland for some time. Persuade Tobias and Fraser of the efficacy of them.
Do you know what? I think it's about the big picture here. So COVID passes are one in a number of mitigations that we have in place. And of course, you'll know that in Scotland, we've had a different approach to all of this. So we've been wearing face coverings in shops, on public transport and so on, all the way through. We've been working from home where that's possible, all the way through. Vaccine passports are another one of the various elements.
Yeah, do they work?
Put into place. Well, I think they do. I think that there is some evidence that as part of a suite of measures, then they are a useful and sensible mitigation. But none of these things are going to work alone. So we need these things in place. We need to make sure that people are taking up their boosters. If people have not already made arrangements to get a booster, please do so. Please go online and get yourself booked in.
Yep.
We need to make sure that people are following all of the sensible advice about face coverings, about hand hygiene. And yes, there may be more guidance to come, and we need to do all of these things. We need to recognise what we're dealing with here, particularly in the context of Omicron and the way that is day upon day expanding its reach into the population.
Right, well, you've heard what Kirsten has said. It's a suite of measures, but it is effective in terms of COVID passes. The government and Boris Johnson says that the measures that are being voted on are proportionate, and yet you're still not going to back it.
No, I'm backing all of it, apart from one element.
Well, you're not backing all of it.
No. I'm making it very, very clear. Plan B, absolute support, but this one element to do with vaccine passports that affects large venues such as in Bournemouth, they themselves don't understand, and it won't make these venues any safer.
Right.
And it's the job of Parliament to scrutinise, to check what's going on. And if we don't do that properly, you get shoddy legislation coming through. And therefore, this has to be policed. These are licensed premises that could lose their licence. So how does this work at 1 a.m. when you get a stag party turning up, one of those characters doesn't have the right ID? How's that going to work? How does it actually make it any safer? Like I said, when you can turn up with a double vax certificate, which I've filled out as a vaccinator myself, I never thought that would be used as an ID card to get yourself in, because it doesn't protect you against the Omicron variant.
All right, well, sorry, Kirsten, go on.
I wasn't trying to come in there,
sorry,
but,
sorry, no, it's all right, Aisha.
So, I mean, I hear what Tobias is saying, and certainly this new variant, it does look like it's very, very difficult in terms of the two vaccinations. But it's a slightly odd situation when so many big venues are doing this anyway. Tory Party conference did this, Labour Party conference did this. It's not just showing proof of vaccination.
That's preparation for these events.
It's also a proof of a negative lateral flow test. I do think people are getting a bit over the top about something which is happening in real life. The other thing where it could help, I do accept your point, it's not a silver bullet. I see what Kirsten's saying, it's part of something bigger. There is evidence coming out that where countries have introduced them, it is encouraging people who are yet unvaccinated to get the vaccination. So surely that is a good thing.
If this is a vehicle to encourage people to get that third vaccination, I think there are other ways of doing it, and we're already succeeding in that. Look at the queues outside St Thomas's and others around the country. It's happening already. I'm saying the venues itself. This piece of legislation will not protect people inside those venues.
But there's still a hardcore group of people who are not going to get vaccinated.
All right, well, one person who is going to vote in favour of it for the Labour Party is the Shadow Health Minister, Andrew Gwynne. He is in central lobby for us. Can you persuade Tobias to actually vote in favour of the COVID passes later on today, as you and Labour are doing?
Well, of course, the serious challenge is knowing more about Omicron and buying us time to learn more about this particular variant. And they are not vaccine passports. If that's what the government was proposing, I wouldn't be supporting them. These are a sensible precautionary approach whereby you can have a negative lateral flow test and you can then have the confidence of being allowed in to large crowd events. I don't think it's unreasonable in a pandemic to know that everybody who's in there either has the protection of being fully vaccinated or has the confidence of being cleared in a lateral flow test to be able to mingle in a crowded event. I just don't see what the issue is here. It is entirely precautionary, and I think, given the unknowns about Omicron, it is very common sense.
Tobias?
Let me cede my time to Fraser, because I think he's going to say exactly what I'm going to say.
They do not offer protection. That's the whole point. If you're between the age of 40 and 70, odds are you were given 2 double jabs of AstraZeneca. Unless you've had your vaccine, you are not protected against getting Omicron. This gives false assurance. This risks actually making things worse. The government's logic has collapsed. And in Scotland, there was a 70-page evidence document trying to find any evidence that they worked, and it failed. Our MP is really supposed to vote through something that the government cannot explain and which the government cannot provide any evidence for. There would be a rubber stamp, not a parliament, if it did so.
Andrew?
Well, look, if we want to say you've not been jabbed, therefore you can't come into a concert or you can't come into a major crowd event or a nightclub, I think that's a slippery slope. I think a good compromise, whilst we learn a bit more about Omicron, is to say if you've been double vaccinated, you can enter these big crowd events, and if you have a negative lateral flow test, you can also enter these big crowd events. We don't want to stop people being able to access big hospitality and pop concerts and nightclubs. What we want to do is ensure that everybody is as safe and secure as it's possible to be in these circumstances until we are able to learn a bit more about Omicron and the threats or otherwise that it might pose the general health of the population.
So has Andrew persuaded you to vote with your own party?
There's only so many ways we keep saying the same thing. 2 vaccinations will not beat Omicron. 3 vaccinations would. So if you offered 3 and said you must have the booster jab or the lateral test only, both of those would make good legislation. Yes. What we've got is something in between, which is bad legislation leading to these events scratching their heads saying this is not going to work. This is not going to make my venue any safer.
I've got a question for you guys. If the government sort of changed their thing on this and came back and called this a lateral flow test certificate, would that persuade you?
That's exactly what the people in Bournemouth are calling for. This is our job, to scrutinise legislation. If it doesn't work, it's bad legislation. To put it in a big box and say, oh, come on, make an effort and support Plan B.
So your objection is the sort of 2 vaccinations, because that's now out of date. If it was up to date and it was just a lateral flow test and then 3 vaccinations when people had it, you'd be comfortable with that?
I would be comfortable with that.
All right, well, on that, Aisha's obviously tried to persuade you fairly successfully if it was changed. Has the Prime Minister called you?
No, he's not called me for a while.
He hasn't called you for a while. We're hearing, though, Fraser, that the Prime Minister is calling people like Tobias Ellwood to try and bring them around.
Yes, he's offering 2 things to the rebels. First of all, he's saying that he's going to drop his plan for a compulsory vaccination. He raised this as a prospect in his press conference last week. Maybe we should have a national discussion about it. Now he's calling them saying, look, I'm not going to do that after all. And the second thing he's saying is, I also promise that the vaccine passport will forever have a little bit added to it where a lateral flow test will come on. So maybe it's not a vaccine passport after all. Now, of course, the problem is that when they originally developed the technology for the vaccines, they promised us they would never bring in vaccine passports. Michael Gove did, Nadeem Zahawi did. Time after time we were told this will not happen. So we've seen a government that constantly changes what it says. So the slippery slope argument, I'm afraid to say, is quite potent with a government that does go back in its word fairly regularly.
Right, well, Andrew, it's not just Conservative MPs, because your colleague Bel Ribeiro-Addy was here on the programme yesterday saying that she felt really uncomfortable with the restrictions proposed. She said, when you go down the road of attempting to force people into a particular position, especially when it comes to health, that goes down an authoritarian route. Is that what you're doing, going down an authoritarian route?
No, we're absolutely not. Look, we don't really know the full threat of Omicron yet, and what we do know is quite scary, that it is highly transmissible at a rate not seen in any of the other variants. And what Plan B allows us to do is to have a little bit of time without it completely wrecking the festive season, without having to undo some of the progress that we've made in recent weeks and months, but to buy that time to learn a bit more about Omicron. I don't think it's authoritarian to ask people to wear face masks in enclosed settings. I don't think it's authoritarian to expect people going to crowded events to show a lateral flow test that is negative. I actually think it's common sense and precautionary, and that's why we'll be supporting these measures tonight.
Right, there is a political point too, Andrew, because I'm hearing that Bell is now going to vote against certainly that part of the restrictions, if not all of it. There are potentially enough Tory rebels there. If you joined them, you could defeat the government on this.
Look, there's nobody more than I that would like to give Boris Johnson a bloody nose, but you have to pick and choose your battles. The fact that Boris Johnson is unable to lead his own party on these issues is a side issue for us, because this is about the health of the public in the United Kingdom. We don't play politics when it comes to serious issues of national public health and biosecurity. I think it is really important that we play this with a straight bat and that we judge the plans before us fairly and considerately. It doesn't mean that we don't have issues with some of the proposals, we do, but what it does mean is that we are willing to support the government when it comes to the health of the nation.
All right, Andrew, thank you. Just before I get your response, Fraser, Kirsten, just confirm for our viewers, how are you voting? How's the SNP voting?
We won't be voting on these measures, although they do mirror the measures that are already in place in Scotland. So, you know, certainly we have not got a problem with them in particular, but these affect England. So these are measures that we will be voting. We already have in Scotland.
Yeah, OK, Kirsten, thank you. How damaging is this, Fraser, for Boris Johnson to be relying on Labour?
Incredibly. I mean, Labour is playing politics. It's playing politics very well. It's worked out. But the most damaging thing they can do for Boris Johnson right now is to demonstrate that he can only get this through with Labour votes because his party doesn't back him anymore. Now, combine this with an opinion poll today showing that Boris Johnson's popularity has plunged to worse than it was under Tony Blair or Gordon Brown at this level. Then all of a sudden, you've got a party thinking, OK, this guy is stopping being popular. He's not really winning elections or got the potential to in the way that he did. And here he is with a Johnson-Starmer vaccine passport, forcing us against the wishes of his party. You combine that, and you've got quite a good formula to give Boris Johnson a very difficult position in the new year. Right. Are you sure Labour exploiting this to their best advantage, do you think? Do you agree with their strategy?
I think they are doing the right thing, because I think, I think it would be not in character of Keir Starmer to sort of suddenly play politics on public health when he himself set a test saying we were going to be a constructive opposition when it came to this pandemic. But I take Fraser's wider point. It causes Boris Johnson more long-term discomfort to know that he could only get this through because of help from the opposition. There's a very difficult by-election on the horizon as well with North Shropshire. There are local elections coming up, which will be with us very quickly in May. I think, and also I think we have to be realistic. The people who ultimately will bring down Boris Johnson, if that's what they want to do, will be Conservative MPs.
Tobias.
Well, I'm puzzled as to why the Prime Minister, number 10, is expending so much political capital on something that we've just proved in our previous discussion on that particular aspect, that particular slither of Plan B. It's unnecessary. It's an unnecessary
We found
battle.
the answer.
You know, I'd prefer to be discussing the potential of Russia to invade Ukraine. My Defence Committee has just come out with a report on the Navy being too small. We're not discussing any of these things. We're focusing on something which is an unnecessary battle. And I hope from Owen Paterson we can learn from this, because if anything, we do need to regroup, take stock, repair ourselves, because we have a general election in a couple of years' time. That's where we need to get things right.
Right. Do you think his authority has been shot to pieces over this?
Not shot to pieces. It certainly needs to be repaired, and it's not irreparable. We need to work on this now. But the first step in that is to recognise that you need to, reconcile and strengthen the bond between the Parliament, the parliamentary party, and number 10. All
right, let's talk about the impact of more cases and more restrictions, as we've been discussing, and what they're having on the economy. We can look at a story on the front of the Scotsman newspaper. I'll try and bring it up for you. Scotland tourism facing financial abyss amid £1 billion of losses after Christmas party plea to curb Omicron threat. There it is there. You can read it briefly as we go to Joanna Nethery, the co-owner of the 5 March restaurant in Glasgow. Joanna, have you been affected, or how have you been affected so far?
Absolutely. I mean, even just this week, we've just watched about £15,000 worth of cancellations come in over the last few days, which is just absolutely catastrophic, given this is kind of your month that you make the money to get yourself through the start of the next year. We were talking with one of the guys the other day, actually, about how, you have people that constantly turn up with problems, and then you have people that turn up with problems and solutions. And someone that turns up with a problem and a solution makes you feel immediately calmer. Yet after 2 years of going through this, we are still left with absolutely no solutions from anyone in power. And when they eventually do tell us how things are meant to run, having effectively run around like headless chickens for a few months, we're then supposed to believe all the guidance that they give us.
How worried are you about the sort of next few months and year?
I have absolutely no idea what's going to happen. I mean, you know, we're a busy place, and the amount we're losing is going to really put us in quite a lot of trouble. So I can't imagine the kind of situation other people are in that haven't been as fortunate throughout the year.
Kirsten, can you offer any comfort at all to Joanna?
You know, I think it's really understandable. What Joanna has said there is incredibly difficult, and particularly for businesses like hers at the moment. And I don't think anybody should pretend anything other than that. I think that we all have to recognise that. I know that there have been significant discussions going on about how best to try and provide the support that's needed. I know that Nicola Sturgeon and Mark Drakeford as well, I believe, have been in touch previously with the Treasury, looking to make sure that we can have support coming, because I think that that's going to be absolutely essential. You know, we know that this is going to be a very challenging time. We know that there'll be a particular impact on businesses like Joanna's, and we need the Treasury to be forthcoming with the support that is going to be needed to support business and also to support individual employees too. So that's something that has to have a bit of urgency put onto it in the coming days, and it can't really be longer than that.
Right, but the SNP government has, you'll agree, effectively introduced lockdown by stealth by advising people
I won't agree that.
cancel. Well, hang on, but you have said you should cancel your Christmas parties. That's the £15,000. It will have contributed that loss just for one business run by Joanna Nethery.
I don't think that is lockdown by stealth. I think we have to remember what lockdown was like, but I don't think that takes away from the challenge, the very real challenge that Joanna's business and others like her are facing. I do hope that, as well as the support that we are absolutely pressing the Treasury for, because it's absolutely vital for these businesses, that there is also the ability for individuals who may have thought about having a Christmas party, perhaps to postpone that. You know, let's not just completely cancel it. Let's hope that people can get together later in the year. But I do think the big thing that we need to see now is this economic support that we've called for.
We'll talk about that. But does that work for you, Joanna, just asking people to postpone their parties then rather than cancel them?
I don't think that's in any way realistic. I mean, from the way we see things, we'd imagine that we'll be in lockdown come January, and I think that it's pretty naive if someone suggests that that's not an incredibly likely outcome. And I'd really like to remind everyone that actually in Glasgow, when the first major lockdowns happened, the local government did absolutely nothing to help anybody homeless or vulnerable. And it was actually myself and a bunch of restaurants that got together and ended up working with a charity to cook for 800 people a day and taking all the food down to George Square to make sure that the most vulnerable were actually looked after. And all these safe policies were nowhere to be seen. So I don't understand why now we're talking about looking out for people, whereas in the past there's been nothing to safeguard the most vulnerable people in the city every time.
Kirsten?
Yeah, I think that's fantastic what Joanna and her colleagues have done. I don't think that, you know, I don't think we can ever overestimate the way that people came together in these immediate and really difficult times.
The council wasn't there. The SNP run council in Glasgow wasn't there. I think that's the point we're making.
I'm sorry, Fraser, I can't hear myself talking over you there. But I think that the other thing that we need to think about, though, is the nuts and bolts of what Joanna talks about in the here and now. So we absolutely do need that economic support. That is absolutely essential, and that does need to come from the Treasury. And I think her point about the bigger picture is really well made.
Right, we'll come on to that in a minute. Sorry, Fraser, what were you trying to say?
Well, Joanna was making the point that the SNP-run council in Glasgow was not there. Of course it's great that people like her decided voluntarily to go and feed the homeless, but where were the local authorities in this? Now, this is a problem. When you come up with restrictions and lockdowns, there are always unintended consequences that hit the poorest hardest. So I can't believe it. Almost 2 years into this, we're about to do this another without a proper analysis of what we stand to gain and what we stand to lose. These vaccine passports in England would have a very big effect on businesses, but what do they stand to gain? Are they going to help at all? Even now, the government cannot do that basic calculation. When that happens, it's bad policy. Bad policy hurts the poorest hardest every time.
Kirsten?
Well, I think that the Conservative government are...
Well, let's just concentrate, because we've got Joanna on, and we're talking about the situation in Glasgow.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that, Jo.
Sorry, we're talking to Joanna, who is based in Glasgow, and talking about the SNP-run council there. So could you just respond to that? And then we're going to get into the funding from Westminster.
Absolutely. And, you know, I think councils all over Scotland and all over the UK, as well as the support that came from the third sector and from people like Joanna and her colleagues, all played a huge part. And I think that is not accurate to suggest that the council were not at the front and centre of that. But I think that it would also be highly inaccurate to suggest that we could all collectively across Scotland and the UK and across the world, I'm sure, have got by the way that we did without people coming together as Joanna and her colleagues did. So, you know, this was a huge, huge effort. We're obviously moving into another challenging situation, and that will take a huge effort.
Yeah, with more restrictions,
all of us, and we cannot do any of that unless the economic support is there, and that does, and I have to come back to that, needs to come from the Treasury.
All right, finally, Joanna, anything you would like to say in terms of what you would like to see right now to keep you afloat?
I mean, with all due respect, I don't think I ever need a Conservative MP to fight my corner. Thank you for that. But, you know, we're looking at a VAT rate going back up at the end of March from 12.5% to 20%. You know, as much as what I've just said potentially looks bad against the SNP government in Glasgow, that wasn't particularly my intention. You know, we really need to actually think about long-term effects of how we can start putting money back into independent business. Maybe perhaps some of the money that we managed to lose on track and trace could potentially be given to people that actually need it.
All right.
I'm fairly sure if I was hired to do a job and it didn't work, I wouldn't be allowed to get onto my boat and sail off into the sunset with absolutely no repercussions.
Joanna Nethery, thank you very much there in Glasgow. Let's just quickly show you this headline, since it's been raised by Kirsten. Businesses to get more funding and possible furlough support if further lockdown is imposed. Would you support that? Do we need furlough to be brought back?
I think the one good thing that the Rishi Sunak and the Treasury has done, perhaps different to other parts of the world, is actually to support businesses from the very start of this. It's a clever mechanism to make sure the skill sets are there, the businesses don't go under. But let's not kid ourselves. Many of them are on their knees now as well. So the furlough system was successful. And if we have to bring it back in, then absolutely I'd support it.
Right. But in what circumstances do you think? I mean, are we getting there to that point?
Well, we're now speculating. The news that's actually coming from South Africa, if that's any yardstick to take, is actually that, yes, it spreads very rapidly indeed, but it is much, much milder as well. So I don't think it helps to speculate at the moment, but it should be something that should bother the Treasury to prepare so we're ready when, if it's required.
Kirsten?
I think we need to be really careful about speculating, which is what you've just said you're not doing, before you went on to speculate about Omicron there. Even if it is milder, and we can't be sure about that, absolutely can't be sure. The thing that we can be sure about is how quickly it spreads. It's spreading so fast that even if it was slightly milder, the numbers of people who would be ill, who would be overwhelming the NHS would be huge. So we need to take this really seriously, and we do need to take difficult decisions and put measures into place that will make sure that we can mitigate against this as far as possible.
Right. If people vote with their feet, Aisha, and simply stop going to restaurants and pubs, how much of a problem is that, do you think, for the Chancellor?
Well, I just really feel for hospitality and all business. I feel that there's already a huge chilling effect because of the arrival of Omicron. Christmas is the golden time of year for hospitality, for so much retail. My own old line of work, comedians, performers, you know, it's the time of year when everybody does good over that, it takes you through for that first quarter. And the problem is so many people are cancelling bookings now because they're so worried, and yet there is no support. And the government, understandably, hasn't put those restrictions in yet because they don't want to pay the support. But I think if I was Rishi Sunak, I would get on the front foot on this. I would start drawing up a package to help people now.
Is that likely?
I wouldn't say likely right now. I mean, a lot does depend on South Africa. They had a report this morning out showing that it is 1/3 less potent than the old variant. Okay. And they haven't locked down. Look, right now, I wouldn't know anything else.
We don't know.
But nothing I would say is either likely or unlikely right now. Who knows?
All right, and we may talk more about the economic impact with the Shadow Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, who's on Politics Live tomorrow at 11:15 ahead of Prime Minister's questions. So let's talk about Human Rights Act reform, because the government is launching a set of reforms to the Human Rights Act. One of the issues it says it wants to address is foreign criminals abusing the right to a family life. Here's Justice Secretary Dominic Raab speaking earlier.
The example I would give is the frustration of deportation orders by foreign national offenders claiming the right to family life. I think there's a good example of elastic interpretations of rights which has resulted in what I would argue is an abuse of the system. This isn't a criticism of the judges, it's a criticism of the Human Rights Act. We can strengthen our tradition of liberty but add some common sense, and that's what our plan will achieve.
Tobias, do you agree that the Human Rights Act is hampering our ability to deal with foreign criminals?
For me, I see this as the bigger picture. We need to be able to sort of return the foreign criminals. There needs to be that agreement in place. I'm sorry that we have to end up changing legislation in this way to do so.
Because you do think it needs to be changed?
Well, I'm going to look in detail as to what's being proposed. It's only just come out today. My wider concern is the fact is, are we perceived to alienate ourselves, from the rest of the world here? In the international rules-based order is eroding. We need people to stand up for it. It needs to be shaped in a way that brings people together, rather than carving a method which takes us away from the collective attitude.
But is Dominic Raab right that it's the Human Rights Act in his mind that is hampering our ability to deal with deporting foreign criminals?
The piece I'm concerned about is that we're using that vehicle to make that case, and whether it is or not, that'll be debated in the House. My wider concern, as I say, is the fact that if parts of the world are dangerous and people then choose to come here, they're not able to be sent back there because those places have become too dangerous. This whole issue to do with, let's say, migrants that are coming onto the shore as well. They come here because their part of the world is now inhospitable, it's dangerous, it's lacking governance or security. Yet we don't then focus on those places to go to the source of the problems in the first place.
Right.
We gave up in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya and places like that.
Right. Why is Dominic Raab doing this, Fraser?
It's a kind of tidying up exercise after Brexit. I mean, previously, you could appeal against the British government by appealing to the court in Strasbourg, and the British government was powerless to tweak the system. But right now, it can do what it wants. So it stands to reason that once you've left the EU, you would have a system. Say, for example, if you want to say to somebody, look, you've lost your asylum appeal, but we're not going to let you say that you've got the right to a family life here for the next 7 or 8 years. We want a far more defined system. That's perfectly logical. And also the asylum backlog right now is absolutely huge, which is in itself driving the channel problem, because people are coming to Britain knowing that the asylum system is in complete chaos and there's little effective chance of deportation. You can spend years gaming the system. He's trying to clean up the system.
Kirsten, your response to this: the government says 70% of successful human rights challenges, which amounts to about 700 cases in the last 5 years, are brought by foreign national offenders citing a right to family life. Do you think there is then some merit in clarifying at least the circumstances in which people can use this as a defence?
This is really poor stuff, to look at trying to get rid of human rights legislation, to be trying to tie that up, as Fraser's just done, with people that are fleeing from war and all kinds of terrible situations that have driven them to cross the channel in the most dangerous and terrible circumstances. This is all wrong. This is absolutely not the direction that anyone would or should think is a positive for the country. And I think it's a really sad day and a really disappointing, although perhaps not surprising from my point of view, way that Dominic Raab is proposing that these things go. It's an odd way to suggest that it's a bit of progress to try and get rid of the Human Rights Act and to try and move away a wee bit from the rules-based order. That is never going to lead to positive things.
Fraser?
It's about who decides the rules. The point of Brexit was the rules should be decided in our Parliament. And nobody's really talking about any weaker protection of human rights. It's just about how those rights are defined and reducing the ability to try to manipulate the system and playing legal games with it. So I don't see it as rights being abolished. It's simply the fact that those rights are defined now by the people elected in this country.
Let's have a look at this headline in the Daily Telegraph. New free speech law to protect against wokery and cancel culture. I can get my mouth around those words. Aisha, something else. Dominic Raab says, and I quote, a combination of court-innovated privacy law, licensed by the Human Rights Act, and the hypersensitivity of some in our society to opposing views has incrementally and surreptitiously whittled away the scope for the rambunctious debate which is essential to our democracy. Your response?
I'm slightly incredulous that this is a really, really important thing that the Human Rights Order, for all the reasons that Tobias Ellwood has set out, to kind of reduce it to a culture war makes me think this is a distraction because of all the other fundamental things that are going wrong that we've been talking about, including fundamental structural issues with Boris Johnson's leadership. Couple of things. I'm old enough to remember when David Cameron attempted to try and change human rights law. It's very, very difficult to do for a reason, the reason that Tobias sets out. But even the security chiefs, who are not wokery in chief, GCHQ, MI5, MI6, Robert Buckland, the former Justice Secretary, have just warned Dominic Raab, saying, be very, very careful, because when you start tinkering with this, there are unintended consequences. And holding up the straw man of here is the evil foreign criminal who beats his wife and does all these things and we have to get him off, fine, But why don't we, instead of ripping up really important legislation, why don't we look at what we can fix closer to home? Our domestic legal system is an absolute mess. Rape has practically been decriminalised. Sexual offences are going unpunished. There's a huge backlog in the court system. There are systemic problems with the prison and the probation system. So if the Justice Secretary wants to get tough on criminals, and I will back him all the way, let's start closer to home and fix the domestic problems.
Fraser, on this issue that Dominic Raab mentions, has the Human Rights Act really whittled away the scope for rambunctious debate?
No, not really. There's a whole bunch of forces undermining free speech, but I wouldn't say that the Human Rights Act is one of them. You've got to be very careful when government says it wants to protect free speech. I mean, they'll be regulating the press in a second. They'd love to get their hands into on the online, YouTube and etc. They'd love to, really, the so-called online harm bills, for example, would put a really big chill down free speech if it were to go ahead in the way the government wants. So I don't think you should really trust government to protect free speech. I think the more distance you put from them and the press, the better.
Let me just show you this headline in The Times. J.K. Rowling attacks Orwellian transgender rape policy. J.K. Rowling has criticised the police in Scotland for saying they will record rapes by offenders with male genitalia as being committed by a woman if the attacker identifies as female. Police Scotland has confirmed it will do this if an accused person insists, even if they haven't legally changed gender. Kirsten, is Police Scotland right to be doing this?
Do you know what? I think what we should be looking at here is probably going back to what Aisha just said. If somebody is accused or convicted of rape, then we need to be dealing with that properly and perhaps asking ourselves also why there are so few people who are convicted, because that actually is where a huge gap exists. And it's a really troubling one. It should really trouble all of us in the context of all of the recent narrative in terms of women expressing the challenges that they face day and daily. And we identify this, and yet we're going off down this road instead of saying, hold on a minute, is there a problem here? Yes, there is a problem, and the problem is violent men.
Can you answer the question that I posed to you about Police Scotland? Are they right to be doing what I've just read out?
I would need to look at the detail of that, but they will be requiring to record what somebody tells them. I think that, you know, that's incumbent upon them. And I know that if somebody was convicted, then there are proper risk assessment processes that are quite robust that the Scottish Prison Service have in place. But I don't think that any of that takes away from the absolutely central point here, which is that if there are, as there are, violent criminals out there attacking women, these are situations that need to be dealt with very seriously, and we need to ask ourselves why the conviction rate for these cases is so low.
Well, Kirsten seems to be saying it's fine for Police Scotland to be doing that, to allow people to self-declare in this particular instance. Do you agree?
Well, I think what this shows is just how we've ended up in a terrible position when we're debating these very controversial issues around biological sex, transgender rights and gender identity. And I think there'll be a lot of women who, if they had been raped, would not be happy with what Police Scotland are doing. But I think there's a broader issue about how we debate these. We have got to be able to have sane, respectful, calm, kind, evidence-based discussions about this. J.K. Rowling has been absolutely hounded. She was doxxed recently on social media for expressing some views. That is not okay. But also, transgender people face a horrific time as well. They're always portrayed as rapists or cheats or something terrible. There's got to be a sensible, moderate view. And within the SNP, by the way, there are big divisions on this. Joanna Cherry had a terrible time in terms of, you know, her views on this. The courts have recently even ruled on this. It is legitimate to have two views on this. And it cannot be beyond the wit of man, woman or whatever to come together and find a way through.
Right, but is it correct, Kirsten, because you weren't precisely clear, do you back Police Scotland's right to say they will record rapes by offenders with male genitalia as being committed by a woman if the attacker identifies as female? Is that correct?
I think it would need to be an individual case-by-case analysis of that. And I think that what Aisha said there is right, that we need to be able to talk about these issues sensibly and without getting into the headline grabbing stuff, which does nobody any good whatsoever.
Well, it's not headline grabbing, it's what Police Scotland actually said and stated, but I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. Bye-bye.